Elizabeth Parris was known throughout Salem as the daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris. She was a shy and reserved girl who spent most of her days helping her father with his duties as a minister. But as the summer of 1692 approached, strange things began to happen in Salem. It started with the fits. Elizabeth's cousin, Abigail Williams, began having fits that left her writhing on the ground, screaming and contorting in ways that seemed impossible. Soon, other girls in the village began to have similar fits, and they began to accuse people of witchcraft. At first, Elizabeth tried to ignore what was happening. She didn't want to believe that her friends and family could be involved in such dark deeds. But as the accusations continued, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. One night, Elizabeth was awakened by a strange noise. She sat up in bed and listened, but all she could hear was the sound of the wind outside. But then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Frozen in fear, the figure began to move closer until Elizabeth could see that it was a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothes and wearing a strange pointed hat. The woman spoke to her in a soft, whispery voice. "You know what's happening in Salem, don't you, Elizabeth?" she said. "You know who's behind it." Elizabeth felt a chill run through her body. She didn't know who this woman was, but she knew that she was right. She knew there was something dark and sinister happening in Salem, and that she was powerless to stop it. The woman continued to speak, her voice growing louder and more urgent. "You must do something, Elizabeth," she said. "You must speak against the lies and the accusations. You must stand up for what is right, even if it means putting yourself in danger." And with that, the woman disappeared, leaving Elizabeth alone in the darkness. The next day, Elizabeth went to her father and told him everything. She told him about the shadowy woman and about the sense of fear and unease that had been growing inside her. And together they made a plan to put an end to the madness that had taken over Salem. It wasn't easy, and it was dangerous, but Elizabeth knew it was the right thing to do, and in the end, she was able to bring an end to the witch trials and the darkness that had taken a hold of the village. Images of witches have appeared in various forms throughout history, from evil, wart-nosed women huddling over a cauldron of boiling liquid to hag-faced cackling beings riding through the sky on brooms, wearing pointy hats. In pop culture, the witch has been portrayed as a benevolent nose-twitch and suburban housewife, an awkward teenager learning to control her powers, and a trio of charmed sisters battling the forces of evil. The real history of witches, however, is dark, and often for the witches, deadly. For centuries, the topic of witches have captivated the minds and imaginations of people from around the world. From ancient times to present day, witches have been feared, condemned, and even persecuted for their supposed powers and practices. In this video, we will explore the history of witches, including their origins, beliefs, and practices. We will also examine the modern-day perception of witches and their continued relevance in pop culture. From powerful priestesses to demonic masters of the occult, the history of witches is a story of dangers of being a woman in a male-dominated world. A fearsome being of fairy tale and myth, the witch has carved out a home in nearly every culture across the world and time. Indeed, the witch represents the dark side of the female presence. She has the power that cannot be controlled. While the witch often conjures depictions of aging, ugly, hook-nosed women hunched over their cauldrons and inflicting toil and trouble on the masses, history tells us that the witch's origins are far more sinister. In fact, those whom we consider to be witches were once healers and hallowed members of their communities. Witches were perceived as evil beings by early Christians in Europe, inspiring an iconic Halloween figure. Early witches were people who practiced witchcraft, using spells and calling upon spirits to help in situations. Most witches were thought to be pagans doing the devil's work. Many, in fact, were simply natural healers or so-called wise women whose profession was misunderstood. One of the earliest records of a witch is in the Bible in the book of 1 Samuel, thought to be written between 931 BC and 721 BC. It tells the story of when King Saul sought the witch of Endor to summon the dead prophet Samuel's spirit to help him defeat the Philistine army. The witch roused Samuel, who then prophesied the death of Saul and his sons. The next day, according to the Bible, Saul's sons died in battle, and Saul committed suicide. Other Old Testament verses condemn witches, such as the often cited Exodus 22:18, which says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." More biblical passages caution against divination, chanting, or using witches to contact the dead. Witch hysteria really took form in Europe during the mid-1400s, when many accused witches confessed, often under torture, to a variety of wicked behaviors. Within a century, witch hunts were common, and most of the accused were executed by burning at the stake or hanging. Single women, widows, and misunderstood women of the community were the main target of society. Between the years 1500 and 1660, up to 80,000 suspected witches were put to death in Europe. Around 80% of them were women thought to be involved with the devil and filled with lust. Germany had the highest witchcraft execution rate, while Ireland had the lowest. The concept of witchcraft is an ancient one, and it is difficult to pinpoint the earliest known witch with any certainty. However, there is evidence of witchcraft and magical practices in many cultures throughout history, dating back to prehistoric times. One of the earliest known records of witchcraft comes from ancient Sumeria, which is now modern-day Iraq. The Sumerians believed in a goddess named Inanna, who was associated with fertility, war, and justice. Inanna was often depicted with snakes, which were seen as symbols of wisdom, healing, and divine powers. The Sumerians also had a class of priestesses known as Kurgeru and Asenu, who were believed to have magical powers and were responsible for performing rituals and spells. In ancient Egypt, there were also women who were believed to have magical powers and were known as hag-faced. These women were often associated with the goddess Isis and were believed to have the magical powers to heal, perform other magical feats. In ancient Greece, the concept of witchcraft was associated with the worship of Hecate, who was a goddess of magic, witchcraft, and crossroads. Hecate was often depicted with dogs and was believed to have the power to grant or withhold fertility, wealth, and good fortune. In the Middle East, ancient civilizations not only worshipped powerful female deities, but it was often women who practiced the holiest of rituals. Trained in the sacred arts, these priestesses became known as wise women and may have been some of the earliest manifestations of what we now recognize as the witch. These wise women made house calls, delivered babies, dealt with infertility, and cured impotence. According to Fontaine, what's interesting about them is that they are clearly understood to be positive figures in their society. No king could be without their counsel, no army could recover from a defeat without their ritual activity, and no baby could be born without their presence. So how did the benevolent image of a wise woman transform into the malevolent figure of the witch that we know today? Some scholars have maintained that the answer may be linked to events long before the birth of Christ, when Indo-Europeans expanded westward, bringing with them a warrior culture that valued aggression and male gods of war, which then dominated the once revered female deities. Others believe that when the Hebrews settled in Canaan 1,300 years before the Common Era, their male-centric and monotheistic view of creation came along for the ride, obeying laws of the Bible. Hebrews believed witchcraft to be dangerous and prohibited it as a pagan practice. A 16th century woodcut of witches as malevolent beings tinkering away in the woods. Centuries later, this fear of witches spread to Europe. In the 1300s, when the plague decimated Europe by killing 1 in 3 people, it also brought with it great fear. Amid the panic, many attributed their misfortune to the devil himself and his supposed worshippers. At this point, the Catholic Church Inquisition, which had already been established for decades, expanded its efforts to seek out and punish the non-Catholic causes of the mass deaths, including devil-doting witches. These women were believed to worship in large nocturnal assemblies, where various social skills were performed, such as promiscuous sex and naked dancing and gluttonous feasting on the flesh of human infants. At the climax of this festival, people at the time believed that the devil himself would appear and participate in an unbridled orgy with all the attendants in order to save the church and its followers from the devil. Then these women had to be tamed. It is with that in mind that Catholic Church inquisitors Jacob Springer and Henrik Kramer wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, a book which assisted with witch hunters in the gruesome task of diagnosing and punishing so-called witches, who, as women, were sexually vulnerable and therefore easy prey for the devil. The manual's vivid description would serve as a platform for zealous witch hunters to act on their prejudice for over 200 years. At the time, Malleus Maleficarum was second to the Bible in terms of popularity. A satirical article, supposedly written by Benjamin Franklin, about a witch trial in New Jersey was published in 1730 in the Pennsylvania Gazette. It brought to light the ridiculousness of some witchcraft accusations. It wasn't long before witch mania died down in the New World, and laws were passed to help protect people from being wrongly accused and convicted. Here are a couple well-known witches throughout history. Marie Laveau, the most famous voodoo queen of all time, is Marie Laveau. Marie was born a free African-American woman in New Orleans in the mid-1700s and became the most well-known voodoo priestess in Louisiana and arguably the world. Everyone came to Marie Laveau for cures and advice. Marie attended Mass religiously, yet she was also a priestess of voodoo and practiced the magical arts. All classes of New Orleans society called on Marie Laveau for magical spells. Marie Laveau, a famous witch in history, lived well into her 90s. Her grave in New Orleans, St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, gets more visitors on Halloween than Elvis Presley's. This famous witch may have been a voodoo queen, but she was also a wise woman and knew her craft well. The Witch of Endor. Back in biblical times, perhaps the most famous witch in ancient history is the Witch of Endor. We hear of her in the book of 1 Samuel in the 28th chapter. Apparently, King Saul calls on her to raise the prophet Samuel's spirit from the dead to advise him in battle. Saul was having a particularly difficult time defeating the Philistines, and all attempts to summon Samuel's spirit through other means failed. Some accounts say God brought Samuel's spirit to Saul, while others claim it was in fact the Witch of Endor. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of the infamous King Henry VIII of England in the 16th century. Scholars say Anne Boleyn was not a witch, but that depends on your definition. She engaged in mystical practices and supposedly employed magical advisors. Throughout her years as Queen of England, Anne Boleyn became an educated, extremely intelligent woman of power. Despite the rumors and accusations of treason, adultery, incest, and witchcraft, which led to her beheading, Anne is known as one of the most influential queens and witches in history. Alison Device, one of the most infamous accused witches in English history, came from the Pendle witch trials of 1612. Alison Device. Alison confessed to many counts of witchcraft, including employing a familiar to hurt her enemies and turning milk into butter and killing children. While these confessions were coerced out of Alison, the story is one of great intrigue even today. There is a statue of one of Pendle witches standing and roughly honoring those accused. Tituba. The most famous witch trials in history are the Salem witch trials, at least in American history. Movies and books and TV shows have been inspired by the true witch trials of dozens of women and men in Salem, Massachusetts in the 17th century. The supposed witch who started it all was known as Tituba. She was a slave. Some say Native American and others say African or a combination, in the Paris house and was accused of witchcraft by two young girls. Later, Tituba confessed to making witch cakes and to knowing magical practices of protection against evil from her living in Barbados. No one knows exactly what happened to Tituba. She disappeared from the record after the trials. People believe she was purchased as a slave by another family. The Bell Witch. While some might argue the Bell Witch isn't an actual witch, but a poltergeist, this terrifying tale started in the early 1800s in a small town in Tennessee with a family by the last name Bell. The Bell family was tormented by a disembodied voice and a spirit that can cause literal physical harm. The haunting became so famous nationwide that even Andrew Jackson came to investigate and found it to be eerily true. But who was the Bell Witch exactly? The theory goes that a local woman felt her property was stolen by John Bell, the patriarch of the Bell family, and sought revenge by sending her astral double to torment and terrify the Bell family. The Blair Witch. Again, another legendary witch who might only be of spectral manifestation. The Blair Witch of Maryland fame. You might have also watched the movie by the Blair Witch Project from the 90s and either loved it or hated it. Either way, locals in Burkittsville, Modesto claim the movie is based off a real local legend. A witch supposedly lived in the woods in Burkittsville in the 1800s, a witch whose ghost still haunts the area. Moll Dyer. Moll Dyer didn't curse George Washington. Sorry to the sources who claim this. Moll Dyer was a woman who lived close to the Leonardtown, Maryland area in the 1600s. Her family, the Dyers, have been living there for the past 400 years. Moll was blamed for the local settlement's harsh winter and other problems. A mob went to her home in the middle of the night and set it on fire and drove her into the cold. She died, legend says, frozen to a rock. The rock now sits preserved in the Historical Society in St. Mary's County. The Fisherwife of Palermo. In the Sicilian witch trials, a woman of whom is called the Fisherwife of Palermo was accused of witchcraft and of consorting with the fairies. She shockingly confessed to going to a magical island and pledging her allegiance to the fairy folk when she was only 9 years old. Her tale seemed too magical to believe, and the court dismissed it as a dream, and she retained her freedom. Giles Corey. One of the most famous witches from the Salem witch trials is Giles Corey. The Salem witch trials is probably one of the most infamous witch trials in the world. Unfortunately, many of the people accused were completely innocent and probably didn't even practice magic of any kind. Giles Corey was accused of witchcraft and then pressed to death with rocks in order for the officials to obtain a confession. They never received one. May he rest in peace. Hecate, Mother of Darkness. Hecate is the Greek goddess of witchcraft and magic. She rules over the darkness, the moon, and the spirit realm. A guardian of thresholds and liminal spaces, it was she who guided Persephone to and from the underworld. In ancient times, she was believed to protect people from roaming evil spirits and perform necromancy. She also had a deep knowledge of herbology and poisons and hallucinogens, such as belladonna, hemlock, mandrake, aconite, and opium poppy. All are associated with her. These plants are dangerous and mind-altering, and like Hecate, they are dark and mysterious, bringing the user's consciousness closer to the spirit world. Lilith, the first feminist goddess. According to Jewish mythology, Lilith was the first woman created by God before Eve. She was also much aligned as a baby-stealing demon of the night whose dangerously liberated sexuality led men astray. Like Hecate, Lilith is associated with the darkness, the moon, and spirituality. Her refusal to be subservient to Adam got her kicked out of paradise and forced to have 100 demon babies for each day that she didn't agree to return. And she never did. Because of this fierce independence and unapologetic sexuality, Lilith is considered the first feminist goddess. Morgan Le Fay, legendary fairy queen. This legendary witch, fairy queen, is a charming and beautiful sorceress that's featured prominently in the legends of King Arthur. She is connected to the Irish goddess Morrigan, who is associated with war, death, and fertility. Early works featuring Morgan Le Fay, such as those by 12th century French poet Crichton de Troyes, portray her as a benign witch and a powerful healer to King Arthur. It's in the 13th century that her character expands to that of an anti-heroine. She is sent to a coven where she becomes Merlin's apprentice and lover. She was believed to have extraordinary shape-shifting abilities, transforming into a variety of monstrous and beautiful forms like queen, fairy, crone, and mermaid. Her narrative shift into a devious and manipulative witch is likely fueled by the Christian prejudice towards a non-religious woman healer with great powers. Rhiannon, goddess of fortitude. In the Welsh myth collection Mabinogi, this beautiful silver-haired witch riding a white horse symbolizes inner fortitude and patience. In Slavic countries, Rhiannon is the goddess of death and rebirth. She is accompanied by the Adar Rhiannon, birds of Rhiannon. These three birds possess magical powers, whose song is said to wake the dead and lull the living to sleep. Both her and her birds have an illusionary power over their position in time and space. She rides her horse up and slowly, remaining elusively out of reach, while her birds appear far closer to the eye than they really are. According to legend, Rhiannon went against her parents' wishes and turned away a fairy suitor in favor of a mortal man. After her spurned suitor steals her infant son, she is framed by her nurses for killing her own child. As punishment, she is forced to wear a horse collar and carry visitors on her back to and from the castle. Rhiannon serves her punishment with a quiet grace until she is redeemed 4 years later. Her story calls to our own inner reservoirs and endurance of strength, and reminds us to trust in the balance of the universe. Circe, the herbal sorceress. This powerful Greek sorceress was said to be a master specialist of magical herbs and potions, and is often depicted with a magic wand or staff. She has a penchant for turning men into animals, most infamously portrayed in Homer's epic tale, The Odyssey, where she invited Odysseus' companions to a feast, laced their mill, and turned them into pigs. Only through the help of Hermes could Odysseus evade her snares, get into her good graces, and turn his shipmates back into human form. She even has a plant named after her, Circea, also known as the enchanter's nightshade, which botanists in the 16th century believe Circe used to charm and lure in her victims. Jezebel, the ultimate Bible bad girl, a legendary witch indeed. Her name is synonymous with cunning, idolatry, and evil. She was born to Ethbal of Tyre, king of the Phoenicians, who were said to worship many multiple gods and goddesses, particularly to the nature god Baal. When Jezebel became queen of Israel after marrying King Ahab, her polytheistic upbringing and rejection of Yahweh earned her many enemies. She is portrayed as a cruel and evil, blaspheming woman that persecuted the followers of Yahweh. Most infamously, she condemned the commoner Naboth to death for not giving land to King Ahab, which he refused on the basis of Jewish law. After King Ahab died, the new king of Israel, Jehu, ordered Jezebel's servants to throw her from a window. Her body was then trampled by Jehu's horse and fed to stray dogs. Despite her gruesome demise, she made it a point to go out in style. Anticipating her execution, Jezebel got all dolled up, dressing in her best finery and painting her face. The earliest known witch trials took place in the late 14th century and the early 15th century in Europe. One of the best documented cases is the trial of Alice Cateller in Kilkenny, Ireland in 1324. Cateller was accused of witchcraft and heresy and was eventually convicted in absentia and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Other early witch trials took place in France, Switzerland, and Germany, among other countries. These trials were often conducted by religious authorities and were based on the belief that witches had made a pact with the devil and were using their powers to harm others. The number of witch trials increased dramatically in the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in parts of Europe where the Protestant Reformation had taken hold. Alice Cateller was a wealthy businesswoman and a widow who lived in Kilkenny, Ireland in the early 14th century. She was accused of witchcraft and heresy in 1324 by her stepchildren and other accusers, who claimed that she had used her knowledge of herbs and potions to kill several husbands and accumulate wealth. Cateller was the first person to be accused of witchcraft in Ireland, and her trial was a landmark case in the history of witchcraft prosecutions. She was charged with a range of offenses, including denying the Christian faith, sacrificing animals to demons, and having sexual relations with a demon named Robin Artisan. Cateller managed to evade arrest and fled to England, where she lived out the rest of her life. However, her maid, Petronella de Meath, was convicted and burned at the stake for her alleged involvement in Cateller's supposed witchcraft. The trial of Alice Cateller has been the subject of much historical and literary speculations over the centuries. Some have suggested that the accusations against Cateller were motivated by greed and the desire to seize her wealth, while others have argued that she was a proto-feminist figure who challenged the patriarchal norms of her time. Today, Cateller's former home in Kilkenny is a popular tourist attraction known as Cateller's Inn, and her story continues to fascinate scholars and the general public alike. Salem Witch Trials. As witch hysteria decreased in Europe, it grew in the New World, which was reeling from wars between the French and British, a smallpox epidemic, and the ongoing fear of attacks from neighboring Native American tribes. The tense atmosphere was ripe for finding scapegoats. Probably the best known witch trials took place in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, in the home of a Puritan minister named Samuel Parris. Parris was deeply concerned about a game his daughter Elizabeth and his niece Abigail had played, in which the two girls looked into a primitive crystal ball and saw a coffin. This vision sent them into convulsions, and within a few days, 9 other girls throughout the community were stricken with the same ailment. Under the pressure of Parris, the girls then named 3 witches who had cursed them: Tituba, their household slave; Sarah Good, a beggar woman; and Sarah Osborne, a widow rumored to have had an illicit affair with one of her servants. All 3 women were social outcasts and thus easy targets for suspicion. The Salem witch trials began when 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams began suffering from fits, body contortions, and uncontrolled screaming. Today it's believed that they were poisoned by a fungus that caused spasms and delusions. Tituba confessed to being a witch and began accusing others of using black magic. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop became the first accused witch to be put to death during the Salem witch trials when she was hanged at the Salem gallows. Ultimately, around 150 people were accused and 18 were put to death. Women weren't the only victims of the Salem witch trials. 6 men were also convicted and executed. Massachusetts wasn't the first of the 13 colonies to obsess about witches, though. In Windsor, Connecticut, in 1647, Alcyone was the first person in America executed for witchcraft. Before Connecticut's final witch trial took place in 1697, 46 people were accused of witchcraft in that state alone, and 11 were put to death for the crime. In Virginia, people were less frantic about witches. In fact, in Lower Norfolk County in 1655, a law was passed making it a crime to falsely accuse someone of witchcraft. Still, witchcraft was a concern. About 24 witch trials, mostly women, took place in Virginia between 1626 and 1730, but none of the accused were executed. One of the most famous witches in Virginia's history is Grace Sherwood, whose neighbors alleged that she killed their pigs and hexed their cotton. Other accusations followed, and Sherwood was brought to trial in 1706. The court decided to use a controversial water test to determine her guilt or innocence. Sherwood's arms and legs were bound, and she was thrown into a body of water. It was thought that if she sank, she was innocent, but if she floated, she was guilty. Sherwood didn't sink, and she was convicted of being a witch. She wasn't killed, but she was put in prison for 8 years. Do witches still exist today? What do modern witches look like? The popular image of the witch is of an old bent woman with a hooked nose, wearing a tall pointed black hat and a long black cape, riding a broomstick in the company of a black cat. This is a stereotype that has been perpetrated and popularized by such diverse media as fairy tales, cartoons, fantasy fiction, TV, horror, and comedy films. Examples of a witch portrayed in a good light in the media are unfortunately rare. However, there are a few examples, such as Samantha in the old American TV series, Bewitched. Today, with the exception of the Halloween night, you are unlikely to see many witches that conform to this popular stereotype. Most modern witches are perfectly ordinary-looking people who you might well meet in everyday life and not even notice anything strange about them. A few have occupations such as tarot reading, astrology, or spiritual healing, where it can be an advantage to dress in outlandish style, but this is definitely a minority. They work in a wide variety of occupations and might be either old or young. Both men or women can be witches, as they were in medieval times. It is often forgotten that in some countries more men were executed for witchcraft than women. Witches as a group of people do tend to have some similarities. There is a deep regard for nature in all its forms in the religion, so many are members of a wide range of ecological and environmental groups. The respect for nature and animals also means many are vegetarians. They are people who believe that more exists in the world and beyond that can be easily explained by science alone. This means that they have a spiritual aspect to them that is often missing in modern Western society. Wicca has both male and female deities and has a special respect for females. This female bias has resulted in many crossovers with feminist organizations. The unfortunate many who were accused of witchcraft endured witch tests that range from the absurd to the unbelievable inhumane. One test required being weighed against the Bible, while others involved torture. Indeed, these are by the far most violent and bizarre tests that the accused were subjected to. One witch test was called Swimming a Witch, involved tying up a victim and throwing them into the water to see if they could float. If a person was accused of witchcraft, they were taken to the nearest body of water and stripped down to their undergarments, and then their hands were bound together and they were dumped into the water to see if they could float. The test hinged on the idea that witches would float because the water would reject them. According to researcher Russell Ziguda, this trial by water approach was based on the religious belief that water was a sacred element. If the person was indeed possessed by evil, then the water would refuse them and force them to the surface. But this method posed an obvious quandary. Innocent victims were likely to drown. The inadequate solution to this was to tie a rope around the victim's torso so that if they sank, thereby proving their innocence, they could be rescued. But accidental drownings still happened. A witch would be rejected by water and forced to float to the surface. There were also rare instances in which the accused actually did float. A 1613 pamphlet titled Witches Apprehended, Examined, and Executed described the case of a woman named Mother Sutton and her daughter Mary in Bedford, England, who both stood accused of being witches. Their guilt was allegedly proven through 2 swim tests, during which they were taken to a nearby mill dam, where they were stripped of their clothing and their arms crossed over their chest, and then bound. Somehow, both women floated to the surface, suggesting that the accusations were true. And then, a second swimming test was carried out, but this time, their hands were bound to their feet. Miraculously, the mother and daughter were once again able to float to the surface. The 2 women were consequently imprisoned and brought to trial, convicted of witchcraft, and executed. This witch test was commonly used to seek out alleged witches across England, and the practice also later spread to Germany and Spain. If someone was suspected of being a victim of sorcery in the 17th century England and America, then a witch's cake was baked in order to see whether or not they were truly hexed. Of course, this turned into a recipe for a disaster. When someone was believed to have fallen ill because of a witch's spell, their urine was mixed with rye flour and possibly ash, and then baked into a cake. After that, the cake was fed to a dog. Dogs were considered familiars, or animal helpers that were associated with the devil. If a dog became ill after eating the witch's cake, then the person whose urine was baked into it was believed to be a victim of witchcraft. It was then suggested that the dog would help sniff out the witch responsible for the spell. Witch's cake test was used in the first accusations of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. This test spread from England to New England and quickly became a primary method to weed out witches during the Salem witch trials. A birthmark, mole, a scar was often enough to prove the accused was indeed a witch. Oftentimes, the accused was publicly stripped before the examination of their body hair was shaved in order to ensure that nothing was concealed from the witch hunters. Identifying a witch's marks was among the strangest and perhaps most damning methods used by witch hunters. The belief originated in the Malleus Maleficarum, a notorious 15th century treatise on finding and catching witches. The book, written by inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, claimed that witches achieved their powers by making a pact with the devil, which was then sealed with a special mark that could appear as a mole, freckle, birthmark, or a scar on the witch's body. Accusers could then contend that anyone who bore an unusual marking on their body was likely a witch. Matthew Hopkins, a prolific witch hunter who dubbed himself as the Witchfinder General of England, outlined in his 17th century guidebook how these markings purportedly helped him to identify a group of witches that he believed were converting into his hometown every 6 weeks. Even a simple birthmark or mole like this could be considered to be the markings of the devil. Hopkins successfully captured one of these women and found that she had the devil's marks in the form of 3 teats on her chest. Hopkins argued that women who practiced black magic allegedly had 3 nipples from which they fed their satanic master or their animal familiars. What constituted these markings of the devil wasn't clearly defined in either manual, and suspicious body marks varied broadly. Additionally, body markings that appeared in the shape of an animal, particularly toads, were deemed especially suspicious. As a result, during the height of European witch hunts, people who had natural birthmarks and moles or possessed old scars on their bodies tried to get rid of them to avoid being accused of witchcraft. Another witch test that was used during the infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 was the touch test. This was used to identify witches who had cast a spell on a victim. The idea behind this witch test was simple. If someone suddenly fell ill after being in contact with another person, and then they were suddenly cured by their ailments after being touched again by that same person, then that individual who touched them was guaranteed to be a witch. If, on the other hand, the victim was still not cured after a second touch by that person, then that person must be innocent. But rules related to witch tests were usually self-determined by the judges and often bent to the will of the accusing public. For example, According to court documents from the Salem witch trials, Abigail Faulkner was among the accused after a number of people fell ill after being in contact with her. Despite Faulkner's denials and even her invocation of God, people were convinced that she was a witch, especially after the sick people were suddenly healed from their fits after being touched by her a second time. The cursed touch witch test was well documented in the Salem witch trials. Faulkner did eventually confess, but only to the fact that she had wished ill upon people because they had made fun of her. She maintained that it was the devil who had cast the spell during her ill thoughts, not her. During the trials, one of the alleged victims of Abigail Faulkner, Mary Warren, fell into a convulsive fit that subsided only when she was touched by Faulkner. To the judges in Salem, this proved Faulkner's capability and that she was imprisoned and sentenced to death for witchcraft. Faulkner narrowly escaped execution because she was pregnant and later was exonerated by the town, but at least 18 people in total were tried on the basis of the dubious touch test in the Salem witch trials alone. One of the most commonly held tenets of witch lore was that anyone who played with evil would not be able to speak the words of Scripture. As such, a frequent witch test required the accused to recite prayers from memory. Based on the belief that witches could not speak words from the Bible, only the innocent would be able to recite scriptures without any mistakes or failures. This left little margin for error, and any stumbling of words could be construed as evidence of the accused's guilt. Cotton Mather, an influential Puritan minister in 17th century New England, defended the prayer test as one of the most reliable ways to detect a witch, according to a letter that he sent to a judge. I should not be unwilling that an experiment be made whether accused parties can repeat the Lord's Prayer, or those other systems of Christianity which, it seems, the devils often make the witches unable to repeat without ridiculous deprivations or amputations. Many of the accused were peasants, likely because they were unable to read the Bible, simply because they were illiterate. But this reading test was also difficult because even if the accused had memorized the Bible, they might be unable to speak in public due to nerves. Indeed, their very life was on the line. Martha Corey, one of the accused witches in the Salem witch trials, she was found guilty and executed by hanging. For example, in 1712, accused witch Jane Wenham was condemned after she supposedly struggled to speak the phrases, "Forgive us our trespasses and lead us not into temptation," during her witch test. Those who knew the Bible by heart were not safe from accusations of devil worship either. As he stood on the gallows before his execution for witchcraft in Salem, Reverend George Burroughs recited the Bible perfectly, and he was still executed on the grounds that his perfect performance had been a trick by the devil. In medieval Europe, most town centers had stations called weigh-houses, where traders and sellers measured their crops or livestock before taking them to the market. But as the witch hunt craze swept across the continent at the turn of the 17th century, these weigh-houses were used to weigh the wicked. The basis for this witch test rested on the widespread lore that witches rode around on broomsticks and could float on water, so this meant that a witch had to be relatively lightweight. Therefore, if the accused was found to be lighter than a stack of Bibles, then they must be a practitioner of black magic. But even if the accused was able to pass the weigh test, executioners were often bribed to skew results. Many innocent people found themselves declared guilty based on this test method. As such, the Weigh House in Oldwater, the Netherlands, was once considered to be a fair weighing site, a title that was bequeathed by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. As the story goes, the Holy Roman Emperor witnessed an unfair witch weighing test at a nearby village. Visitors can weigh themselves at the Museum de Heksenwaag in the Netherlands to see if they pass the witch test. A woman who was accused of witchcraft was weighed and found guilty, but the emperor could not believe that the woman could be so light. He declared the test invalid and ordered the woman to be weighed again in Oldwater, which was already built in for a reputation as a fair weighing site. The woman was cleared of her charges and released. It is said that the emperor tried to pay the weigh test master for their service, but the man declined, impressing the emperor, who immediately declared that Oldwater was a fair weighing site. The weighmaster was then given authority to dispense official certificates that declared test subjects not guilty of being a witch. One of the more violent witch tests was undoubtedly the pricking and scratching. As with a search of the devil markings, this test was based on the idea that a pact with the devil would leave a mark on the witch's body. Even those without a single birthmark or mole on their skin couldn't escape this witch test. However, the suspect was instead stripped naked and subjected to the cruel practicing of pricking, which aimed to detect witches' marks under the skin by repeatedly pricking the accused with a special needle. Witch hunters claim that sometimes these evil markings were hidden and could only be uncovered by pricking and scratching. Witch hunters also claim that a witch could feel no pain during this agonizing trial and poked at the accused until they found a less sensitive spot. Additionally, if the accused didn't bleed from this ordeal, then they were declared a witch. This witch test was so popular that it spawned an entire industry devoted to pricking. Those who took up work as a professional pricker were usually con men looking to make easy money, and they would scan their victim's body for spots that were less sensitive and less likely to bleed in order to claim that they were indeed a witch. In Scotland, a woman named Christian Cadell was so desperate for money that she disguised herself as a man so that she could be hired as a witch pricker. Her plan worked, and she was hired in Elgin in March of 1662. Cadell's contract was a lucrative one. She made 6 shillings a day for maintenance and another £6 for every witch that she was able to identify. An average wage at that time was about 1 shilling per day. Her scheme as a witch pricker came to an end after she poked a royal court messenger, who successfully petitioned the government for her arrest. She was ultimately banished to the then colony of Barbados. It's estimated that Cadell helped condemn at least 6 innocent people through her witch pricking. Witch hysteria lasted for several hundred years, with an estimate as high as 100,000 for the total number of people executed. The last recorded execution in Europe happened in 1782, when Anna Goldeye was killed in Switzerland. Some sources also name Barbara Zedunk killed in Prussia in 1811 as the last person executed, but this is held in dispute because records of her trial do not mention legal charges of witchcraft. In the United States, the final recognized legal trial for witchcraft took place decades later in 1878, and perhaps not surprisingly centered around Salem, Massachusetts. Fortunately for the accused, the trial was dismissed by the courts and did not end violently for anyone. As hysteria over witches died down in Europe, witch tests, at least as legally recognized practices, became obsolete into the 18th century. The hysteria dissipated for a number of reasons, including the higher standards set for evidence imposed within the courts. Witches' familiars. In folklore and mythology, a witch's familiar is an animal that is believed to assist the witch in their magical practices. Familiars are often depicted as cats, but they can also take the form of other animals, such as dogs and birds and toads, or even insects. The concept of familiars dates back to medieval Europe, where the belief in witchcraft and the use of familiars became widespread. It was believed that witches could summon these spirits or demons in the form of an animal, which then would carry out their bidding. Animals were often thought to be able to communicate with the witch and to have magical powers of their own. During the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, familiars played a significant role in identifying and prosecuting accused witches. It was believed that any animal seen in close proximity to a suspected witch was likely to be their familiar, and many innocent animals were killed as a result. In modern times, the belief in familiars has largely been relegated to the realm of folklore and fantasy. However, the idea of animal companions playing a role in magical practices remains popular in some contemporary pagan and Wiccan traditions. Witches on broomsticks. The association of witches with broomsticks is thought to have originated in pagan rituals where broomsticks were used to sweep the ritual space before a ceremony. Brooms were also believed to have magical powers, such as the ability to sweep away negative energy, and were thus associated with witches and the supernatural. In addition, there is a popular legend that witches would use a special ointment to help them fly on their broomsticks. The ointment was said to be made from hallucinogenic plants such as deadly nightshade or mandrake, and was applied to the broom handle or to the witch's body. Over time, these pagan and folk beliefs became intertwined with the popular image of witches, and the broomstick became a popular symbol of witchcraft and magic. Today, the image of a witch riding a broomstick is a common trope in popular culture and is often used to represent the ideas of a powerful, magical woman. Witches have been a popular subject in pop culture for many years. From classic literature to modern movies and TV shows, witches have been portrayed in a variety of ways, ranging from the traditional cackling hag to the modern empowered woman. Some of the most iconic depictions of witches in pop culture include The Wizard of Oz of 1939. The Wicked Witch of the West is one of the most famous witches in film history, with her green skin and her pointy hat and her cackling laugh. Bewitched, 1964 to 1972. This TV series followed the life of a witch named Samantha, who tries to live a normal life with her mortal husband. The show was known for its comedic take on witchcraft. Hocus Pocus, 1993. This film follows three witches who are resurrected in modern-day Salem by a teenager and the chaos that ensues. The witches, played by Bette Midler, Sarah Jessica Parker and Kathy Najimy are known for their over-the-top personalities and their hilarious antics. Charmed, 1998 to 2006. This TV series follows three sisters who discover they are witches with magical powers and use their abilities to fight evil. The show was known for its strong female characters and focus on sisterhood. Harry Potter series, 1997 to 2007. Harry Potter books and movies feature a wide variety of witches and wizards. The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, 2018 to 2020. So this Netflix series follows the teenage witch Sabrina Spellman as she navigates her dual life as a mortal and a witch. The show was known for its dark, horror-inspired take on witchcraft. I also liked the one where she was the teenage witch, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, back years ago. I like that one. These are just a few examples of the many depictions of witches in pop culture. Over time, the portrayal of witches has evolved from negative stereotypes of the past to more complex and nuanced representation that explore the power and potential of witchcraft. If you were a person living at that time, how would you try and defend yourself from witches? You'll want to defend the thresholds of your body and your house. You have to keep to the rules. If you suspect one of your neighbors is a witch, do not ever let them have their last word in a conversation. Anything she says must be thrown back at her before it infects you, and don't let her give you anything, especially anything connected with food. Don't ever let her across your threshold. Use witch marks to stop her from crossing into your house or from allowing her familiars to cross into your house. Witch marks are ancient boundary spells. One of the most common is their interwoven initial M for the Virgin Mary, which persists long after Catholicism have been forbidden. Another is a spiral in which the roaming entity will get lost. Throughout history, witches have been a subject of fascination and fear. They are often associated with magic and spells and supernatural powers. In many cultures, witches were believed to gain the ability to communicate with the spiritual realm and to manipulate the natural world through spells. Unfortunately, this fascination and fear of witches also led to widespread persecution and violence, particularly during European witch hunts for the 16th and 17th centuries. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft and subjected to brutal torture and execution. From their ancient origins to the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, witches have played a significant role in shaping the beliefs and practices of many cultures. While the modern-day perception of witches has evolved to a more positive and empowering image, the fear and persecution of witches in the past is a reminder of the dangers of intolerance and superstition. As we continue to learn more about the history of witches, it's important to approach the topic with an open mind and a critical eye. While some beliefs and practices associated with witches might seem strange or even dangerous, it's important to understand them in their historical and cultural context. It is crucial to recognize that the persecution of witches was a tragic and unjust chapter in human history, and that we must strive to create a more tolerant and accepting society where people are not judged or persecuted based on their beliefs and practices. Today, witches are often associated with modern pagan and Wiccan spiritual practices, which celebrate nature and the divine feminine. Many people also use the term witch as a symbol of empowerment and resistance against oppressive systems. In the end, the history of witches is a reminder of the power of belief and the importance of understanding and respecting the diversity of human experience. By learning about the history and facts on witches, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the richness and complexity of human culture and history. Witches. Thank you all for watching, and please share it out if you enjoyed it. Leave me a comment. You know I love my comments. And I hope to see you guys next time on Tales Told in the Dark.